Hey everybody, welcome to video 29. We'll give this another shot. Had some people tell me that the old one wasn't recording audio the whole time, so just reshooting video 29 here. So going back, isotonic versus isometric. These contractions for isotonic are going to mean that the muscle is changing length. And so you have different types of isotonic contractions. You have concentric contractions, which is when the muscle is going to shorten as that muscle tension or that muscle strength is increasing. You have eccentric, which is when the muscle is going to be lengthening and tension will be decreasing during this time. Most of your weightlifting or your free weight exercises are going to be isotonic contractions. Isometric contractions means that the muscle does not change length, but the tension within the muscle is going to increase. So iso meaning same. So isotonic going back here is the same strength. So that muscle is shortening in order to maintain that contraction. The muscle is lengthening in order to maintain that. Though the whole point of those is you're either increasing or increasing that tension. But isometric is equal measure, so that muscle stays the same length. These are things like wall sits, or if you were to try to push an object that is way too heavy for you to actually push, your muscles are staying the same length, but you're increasing the tension within those muscles. Also remember that a motor unit means a single motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it's going to be innervating. Motor units can actually change in size, or I shouldn't say change in size. They can come in different sizes depending on the muscle. So if you have a very small motor unit, that means you have one motor neuron and very, very few muscle fibers that it's controlling. So these are going to be used for very fine movement. So like in your eye muscles, you have a lot of those in your fingers as well. You can be very dexterous in those small motor units. Large motor units are going to allow for gross movement, very large, powerful movement, such as that in the quadricep muscle, where you might have a single motor neuron and thousands of muscle fibers being controlled by that single motor neuron. Small motor units can be located in large muscles to allow for a range of tension within that muscle. We call that recruitment. So if that muscle sometimes is used for very fine movement, you can have a bunch of small motor units. But if that muscle is also used for very large, powerful movements, you're just going to recruit more of those motor units to allow for a more powerful movement. So an example here, small motor units within the biceps brachii to allow you to pick up a feather and not actually like grab that feather and then swing it up towards your face, because you need a lot of power to pick up that feather. But you want to have very delicate, a very dexterous movement with that. So you only recruit just a couple of motor units for that. But if you're lifting a very heavy dumbbell, you need more and more motor units in order to lift that heavy dumbbell. And so you have to recruit more of those. You can switch back and forth. Kind of a unique thing of muscle fibers when we talk about recruitment is if to allow a muscle to maintain a contraction for a longer period of time, you can actually recruit different motor units and switch back and forth. So all within, say, like the biceps brachii muscle, if you're holding a dumbbell out for a long period of time, you can switch what motor units are being recruited and which ones are actually firing and contracting to allow those muscle fibers to not get completely fatigued and allow that muscle as a whole to not get fatigued too quickly, to allow you to hold it for a longer period of time. We'll also talk about twitch and tetanus when it comes to muscle contractions here. A twitch is usually a very short, jerky contraction. Generally, when we think of a twitch, it's some sort of issue with the nervous system and is not normal muscle movement. Normal muscle movement we would call tetanic. It's very coordinated and it's very fluid. It's not short and jerky. And so what happens with tetanus or a tetanic movement is you have a series of twitches, we'll say here, that are stimulated so fast that they actually blend together. And we'll see what that looks like on a graph here on the next slide here. It does not mean that every muscle fiber is contracting, but just the ones being stimulated are contracting, kind of that all or none response here. So here you can see what a single twitch might look like, or a single muscle fiber contracting would look like, where it's going to contract, increase that force, and then it's going to relax. If you increase the time in between stimuli, you see that muscle fiber is actually resting in between. But if you send another stimulus before that muscle fiber has relaxed, it's going to add its force to the previous, and it'll add and add and add until you get this very fluid movement here. This is at maximum force for this muscle because the stimulation is coming so fast that that muscle isn't relaxing in between. It's one fluid motion. So this is what we would call a tetanic contraction. Talking about muscle fibers here, there are three types of muscle fibers. You have your slow oxidative muscle fibers. These are going to be using aerobic respiration, which means they are using oxygen. They tend to have very low strength and a lot of blood supply. If they're using oxygen, it makes sense that they need that high blood supply. And they have a very high number of mitochondria being able to carry out that respiration. So these muscles fatigue very, very slowly because they have lots and lots of oxygen, lots and lots of mitochondria to produce that ATP. We see these in muscles responsible for things like maintaining posture. You don't really think about having to maintain your posture just because those muscles are slow oxidative. They have very low strength, but they're able to maintain long periods of contraction. You also have your fast oxidative muscle fibers. They also use aerobic respiration, this oxidative phosphorylation here. They also have lots and lots of mitochondria, but they can provide at least a moderate amount of tension, such as those responsible for walking. And then you have your fast glycolytic. These are going to be using only glycolysis and then lactic acid fermentation here. These are very, very high strength muscles. They're going to muscle fibers. They're going to contain lots and lots of glycogen, which are extra sugar stores. They have very few mitochondria just because they never get to that point, essentially, of needing to use the mitochondria to produce ATP. They're only going to be using glycolysis in the cytosol. So these muscles fatigue very, very quickly because they don't have the oxygen. They don't have the large amounts of ATP. They basically burn up their energy very quickly. And we see these in muscles responsible for sprinting. So your slow twitch fibers are going to be your slow and fast oxidative. I know fast oxidative has the fast in its name here, but it is a slow twitch fiber because it's using oxidative phosphorylation, this aerobic respiration here. And then fast glycolytic muscle fibers, these are what we would call your fast twitch muscle fibers. Muscle tone, when it relates to strength training, basically is referencing the amount of contraction present in a muscle all the time. The goal of strength training is hypertrophy, hyper meaning over, and so trophy referring to basically muscles usually. So this is muscle growth. When you hypertrophy, you're not adding muscle fibers. You're already genetically predisposed to how many muscle fibers you're going to have. But with strength training, you can actually increase the number of actin and myosin myofilaments within each muscle fiber. And that's what's going to make that muscle grow larger and grow stronger. And you're trying to avoid atrophy, which would be the opposite, where that muscle is actually losing myofilaments and you are becoming weaker. In order to achieve the best results, you want a balance of isometric and isotonic movements. And like I said, it increases in an increased amount of myofilaments, your actin and myosin, but not an increase in muscle fibers. That increase in myofilaments makes muscles get more massive. Basically, you're packing more actin and myosin into that. And it is stimulated by testosterone. So this is why guys tend to bulk and girls tend to tone, is because guys have that testosterone to stimulate more myofilament production within those muscle fibers. A lot of your strength training muscles are going to be using fast glycolytic muscle fibers. So that's why you don't, for example, walk very much in weights class. You may walk to warm up, but that's not relating to strength training. You're training those fast glycolytic, those fast twitch muscle fibers to be able to create a fast and powerful movement in your weights class. Endurance training or aerobic training, on the other hand, usually does not result in hypertrophy. You are not growing that muscle at all. Instead, you're using a lot of isotonic movements and training those fast and slow oxidative muscle fibers to be able to maintain a contraction for longer periods of time. How you do that is you stimulate your body to use a process called angiogenesis, which is the creation of more blood vessels to those muscle fibers. You don't increase the actin and myosin within the muscle fiber. It just receives a higher amount of blood flow, and with more blood flow means more oxygen, means that muscle is going to be able to sustain contraction for much longer periods of time. So you get much more efficient oxygen and glucose delivery. You do actually see an increase in the mitochondria within those cells as well, meaning that you can undergo cellular respiration, which is a slower process than your fast twitch muscle fibers, but it can actually use glucose and oxygen to its fullest efficiency. And so you're going to be able to maintain that contraction for much longer periods of time. One thing with training we see is performance enhancing substances. So we get a lot of talk about these. Strength training athletes may use anabolic steroids, which are just a different form of testosterone from a chemical class standpoint that are going to stimulate muscle formation. A lot of your endurance athletes, you may hear, I shouldn't say a lot, hopefully not very many, but you may hear about them using erythropoietin or EPO, which stimulates the production of red blood cells. And if you have more red blood cells, you're going to increase your oxygen carrying capacity. And with more oxygen, you're able to endure those muscle contractions for much longer periods of time. So you typically see EPO being used in like your runners and your bikers and things like that. Human growth hormone or HGH increases muscle recovery after exercise. So a lot of athletes with long seasons, I should say, again, hopefully not a lot, but some may use HGH to increase muscle recovery, especially late in their career. When they're older, their body just doesn't recover quite as well. They may turn to HGH to increase that muscle recovery after exercise so that they're able to maintain their level of play for longer periods of time. Another one, creatine phosphate, is thought to deliver ATP quickly to muscles. Its effectiveness is uncertain. It's thought it may play a role with things like the C-AMP pathway, with how that hormone is used, but its effectiveness, not really sure. Creatine generally is something you probably want to stay away from just because it's very difficult to get enough water to those muscles. And really what that creatine do, pulling that water towards the muscles, if you were drinking enough water in the first place, you probably would get very similar results. Another thing I get asked about is cramps and fatigue. So cramps can play a role in the neuromuscular junction, or that's where we can see where it might cause an issue. So such as if you don't have enough electrolytes, such as sodium and calcium, that neuron might not release acetylcholine, or it might not allow sodium or have enough sodium to move into the muscle. It might cause a cramp, or it can cause too many. Twitches are basically a version of this. Usually you have some sort of problem with the nervous system instead of your electrolyte levels when we talk about a twitch, though. But low numbers of sodium and calcium can cause issues. Fatigue can occur from a lack of electrolytes, going back to the cramps here, although generally we see it with a lack of ATP or from a weakening of those muscle fibers as they're used, possibly torn and broken down, those micro tears. So they need that time to recover. Like I said, they might tear or weaken. When torn, tendon and ligament injuries can be very serious because those tissues are avascular, meaning they do not have a great blood supply to them. And so if you don't have a great blood supply, your healing process is very slow. You're not getting the materials, not getting the nutrients you need to be able to fix those tears. And so in class, we'll take a look at these here. These are two different Achilles tears that we see. One is DeMarcus Cousins. The other is Kevin Durant, although Kobe Bryant also is famous for his Achilles tear and then being able to shoot 2 free throws immediately after before exiting the game here. But they are very serious injuries. They can take upwards of like a year to recover. So they can be very difficult injuries to